This is Dan with the Salty Sea, and I'm here today with a special kind of video. I'm going to be talking about the deployments and victory conditions and twists that you can create to sort of run the best tournament when you sort of dive into Warcry in person, which we're all very excited to do. And so to help me with that, to help me with creating sort of the first video general's handbook for Warcry, I had to bring in the one, the only. If you are watching this video, you probably already know who he is, but if you don't, you should definitely check him out. The godfather of the online Warcry community, Reedo. Reedo, say hello.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, no
And I
problem.
wish I was the godfather of anything, but I'm really not. But thank you very much.
No, you are. It's no need to be modest. Um, okay, so I guess let's just get into it, right? So I wanted to first talk a little bit in generalities about, um, what makes setting up a tournament pack a little different than playing at home, right? Because, when we play at home, we can choose whether we're sort of playing to win or playing, playing just for fun or silly games. And, we can set things up differently. But for a tournament, you kind of have to set things up beforehand. A lot of tournaments require a lot of, say, Age of Sigmar tournaments will give you the tournament pack ahead of time so you can see the missions and sort of set up your list beforehand. So, yeah, Rito, how would you approach setting up a tournament, like kind of in contrast to just playing at home?
Yeah, so many of the things you already mentioned. So I actually did set up a tournament myself in the past, so I got a bit of experience there. It was definitely important to make sure all the battle plans were set before. One of the issues is gonna be getting your terrain done because, well, for how we did it, everyone was supposed to have be playing on the same boards. Um, which is because terrain is of such big importance in Warcry. It felt like it's a big necessity there. And well, obviously you're not drawing random cards. And yeah, if people know ahead of time what scenarios you're playing, can adjust their warbands as well accordingly.
hmm And then one other thing that I think is important for creating a tournament is that you kind of have to go into it knowing that you can't control the reasons why people have shown up. So, assuming you have a prize for first place, or sometimes even if you don't, there are going to be people there who are really there trying to just win, right? And win as many games as they can. And then there are also going to be people there who maybe they don't play that often at home, or maybe this is the first round of the tournament is going to be their second game ever, where they just learned the rules, the Thursday before, and now it's Saturday, and they're playing because, their friend is really into the game and dragged them to the tournament. Um, so you do have to kind of create a pretty flexible environment that can support both really hardcore competitive play and people who are there for fun.
Absolutely, and you have to make sure that every kind of warband, even if someone is bringing his Nurgle Rotbringers, who we all know are garbage and bottom tier, even if someone's bringing them, you want them to have at least a game that they feel like they can win, and not just get ruffle stomped every game, and it's gonna be a miserable experience. So I mean, wargaming is about fun, right? And you do want everyone to have fun, even the ones who are less competitive there.
Yeah, I think the way that a tournament scene dies is if going 1-4 makes you wish you hadn't shown up, right? So if
Right.
you can kind of create an experience where, because there are some people who if they go 0-5, no matter how good the tournament experience is, they'll still be angry about it. But for 1-4, I think of it as, well, you did show up and win a game, so if I created the right experience for you, you should have been able to find a fun time at some point in there, somewhere along the line.
Absolutely, and as well, like you don't have to win to feel like it was a good game. You just have to get close, in my opinion.
Yeah,
There's such a big margin between winning and losing, and like winning closely or stomping the opponent. Yeah.
yeah, especially in a dice game. I feel like any close game, I don't really care if I won or lost generally, but you can't always control whether your players felt that way, but I think a lot of people
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Um, so then one other thing that's I think going to lead into sort of the meat of what we're going to talk about today is um, setting up sort of, Warcry with, I think it's something like 36 quote unquote balanced deployments, and um, with how many victory conditions there are. I think someone in the Discord actually did the math on this, and there are thousands and thousands of potential games you can play.
Oh
Um,
yeah, it's ridiculous. You multiply the number of each card stack with the all the other card stacks.
right. Um, and most of them do turn out pretty reasonable, balanced, and interesting games, but a lot of them, there are a lot of duds out there. You can get a lot of sort of deployment plus victory combinations that mean that the game is essentially over at the end of round one. Sort of everyone kind of sees what's possible and what's not possible, and can kind of scratch their head and be like, okay, this one's done. Which um, not everyone hates that, right? Because it can be nice to go, okay, let's reset up for a new game with new cards. But for a tournament, I think that that's kind of a disaster, right? Because you only have so many rounds to play with. So I think avoiding that kind of experience is really vital. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. So that's why you and I both did uh, actually spent quite a bit of time on this before recording today to put together some combinations of deployment and victory mission and twist that can create really interesting games that can kind of be part of, I mentioned the Warcry General's Handbook before. So just the way in AOS um, they have all these lists of specific missions that a tournament organizer can choose, and so um, we're sort of trying to create, starting off a list of 8 that we know are going to make good games. That, if you're running a tournament in your local game store, you should be able to cherry pick any of these 8 and know that that round is going to be a good time. Um, so yeah,
Indeed,
that's
and it's gonna give you a good impression of how we kind of come up with these, and as we talk about what we think is good about each of the deployments, victory conditions, and so on, I'm sure you'll find ones that you like as well, and for many of the same reasons. And I think once you get into the reasoning, you'll find it easy to make up your own combinations there.
yeah, I think so. I think if we can provide a framework for the viewers, then we'll be providing them more than just the 8 scenarios that we outline here.
Yeah.
All right, so we can just get into the first one right away. So I think we'll just split off between, so one of mine, then one of yours,
Sure.
kind of that way. So the first one that I wanted to talk about was Dance of Death. So this is one, and I'm going to actually switch to it so that we can just take a look. So Dance of Death is one where the shields start right on round one, actually fairly close to each other, with the hammers right behind them, supporting them. And I think it pairs really well with the victory condition Bloodmarked, because the each player can kind of choose between their shield and hammer, sort of which unit they want to protect, and then can legitimately kind of create a fortress to protect it. But with the daggers coming on in round 2, it means that if you it makes you make actual tactical decisions about how you're going to defend your one vulnerable unit, because the situation at the beginning of the game is just different than how the situation at the end of the game is going to look. Bloodmarked I really love in a ton of different situations, but I think just Dance of Death creates a really interesting interplay with Bloodmarked on its own.
Yeah, I think what's very interesting about Bloodmarked is that it just gives you, like, you can go one of two ways, in my opinion. Either you choose one of your strongest, beefiest fighters, but then run the risk of having to keep them in the back and protecting them, which might be easier to protect your beefy fighter, but he might not contribute as much as he normally does. Or on the other hand, choosing one of your weaker ones that you don't mind not participating as much, but yeah, he can be killed easier then. So that's, to me, what makes this scenario most interesting.
Yeah, and I also like about Bloodmarked that it gives you a slight incentive to run a type of unit that's generally not very good in Warcry, which is the sort of mobile defensive unit. So I think of Saurus Knights as being sort of the poster child for this type of unit, where it's they move pretty well and they are pretty survivable for their points, but they just do so little damage. A lot of chaff units, or sorry, a lot of when you put a chaff
Cavalry.
unit on a horse, then
Yeah.
you get the kind of cheap mounted unit. A lot of
Yeah,
cheap
yeah.
mounted units are really poor in the game in general, but specifically in Bloodmarked are pretty good because they don't cost
It's
too
true.
much. They're very survivable and they can run around. Um,
They also kind of work for the what's it? The treasure missions.
mm-hmm.
Mm, sometimes, at least.
And it gets to something we talked a little bit about before the show, which was how nice it can be if in your tournament pack you create a variety of missions where different types of lists are good in different missions, um, which both
Yes.
forces people to stay away from total skew lists if they want to go 5-0, and it also, variety is the spice of life, right? Players are less likely to get bored if we're doing that.
Exactly. Like, I mean, there's people who run all skink with bolt spitters lists, for example, who do perform very well in many tournaments. But for example, in Bloodmark, if you Bloodmark a skink who has 8 HP and 2 toughness, well, he's easily getting mauled. If someone really puts his mind to it and murders that guy, or has a ranged guy of his own, then you lose the victory very, very quickly. So, as you said, nice to have that mind game there.
Mm-hmm. Right. It makes it so even if you do want to do skink spam, all of a sudden you can't just do maximum skinks. You'll still probably be able to fit 7 or 8 of them in a list, but that's very different from I've seen people post 12 or 13 skink
Yeah,
lists online.
13 is what I had in my mind as well.
Yeah. So then I just wanted to talk about two twists that I think go really well with the Dance of Death and Bloodmarked, which are Bitter Rivals and Battle of Wits. So Bitter Rivals is cool. It works even better for one of the things that you talked about, which is cut off the head. But Bitter Rivals, just with +1 attack and +1 strength, when leaders fight each other. In a lot of matches, it doesn't matter at all. But when it does matter, it creates just such a cool, sort of evocative game that people will really
Yeah,
remember.
it's like a narrative experience almost. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Battle of Wits, I think I saw you list this one
No, I'm running
as,
Winds of Fate actually.
oh, okay. Yeah,
I'm
so
going crazy.
yeah, Winds of Fate is Battle of Wits' crazier brother, but both of them I really like because Warcry is a game where generally the unit stats matter a little bit more than abilities do. It's debatable how much more, but I think in general, warbands with just really good stats can really dominate, and so Battle of Wits just makes abilities matter just a little bit more, which can be a nice sort of change to the game. And
Yeah.
then I also put in Eerie Silence, so this might be a time, just get this out right off the bat, where a lot of folks that I talk to online about Warcry have sort of homebrewed this system for choosing twists, where you draw 3 off the deck, and then each person discards 1, and then you end up with the twist that you have. So one way to set this up for a tournament, you can just dictate the twist to the players, and that works perfectly fine. But I wanted to also set up kind of an alternative system that people can do, where you sort of provide the 3 twists, and then the players can choose which ones they're going to use. And this also is a little bit more friendly to new players, because you can have one of the 3 twists be Eerie Silence in every round. Now, that's the twist where nothing happens. And so if both players just find twists a little overwhelming or don't like them, then they can just agree not to have a twist, essentially. They can just choose Eerie Silence and nothing happens. But if that's not the case, and even one player wants to have a twist, they can discard Eerie Silence, and then you are playing with one of the ones that you've chosen. So it can kind of create this sort of interactive pre-game, sort of sub-game for your players in the tournament that doesn't take a lot of time, but can add some depth while also being easier to new players.
Yeah, and it's something you see in actually a lot of competitive gaming environments where, for example, factions are chosen or heroes are chosen or something before a battle starts, where you're giving players the opportunity to not allow for one specific thing to be used by the opponent because they know it's gonna counter anything they're going to do. And similarly, in Warcry, there's twists that are going to completely make your warband redundant. Like if you have a -1 speed debuff to your Nurgle models, you might as well not play. And I think you're totally on the right path here to say, well, we present you with 3, and if you think that one of them is unplayable for you, well, just eliminate it.
Right. So, like, now to move on to yours, so I'm thinking, if I'm playing and I see Winds of Rot and Eager for the Fight, so if I have a slow warband, I know I'm going to discard one of the other 2 and then hope that my opponent doesn't catch it. Or if I have a lot of Strength 3, Strength 4, and my opponent is all Toughness 3, well, I'm going to do a lot less damage to them if Winds of Rot is the twist, so I might just get rid of that twist immediately. And then my opponent gets to decide if it's going to be no twist or if it's going to be +1 move across the board.
Exactly. So you still don't get to decide per se, but it also benefits people who have a good knowledge of the game in general and who have who know how their warband performs in comparison to others and what the strengths of other warbands are. Because if I know, well, I'm fighting someone who's got a bunch of clan rats, maybe a bunch of plague monks and giant rats, I really don't want that +1 toughness to happen. Because they are fast as it is, I can't really do anything about that anyways. But if they are all toughness 4, that's going to get real annoying.
Yeah.
So,
So then let's take a look at that Bloodbath plus Hunt for Glory combination. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about this combination?
yeah, so I think you've chosen Bloodbath as well as for one of your games. Maybe not. Anyways, I think Bloodbath is a really cool one
I
because
chose Blood Rush, but I
it
do
puts a
like
lot of
Bloodbath.
models on the board early on. So it spreads them around really, really well. So you start with a lot of the board covered early on. Um, for Hunt for Glory, you're going to to each player is placing one objective marker, and there's going to be one in the center. Now everyone is gonna be in the center for is gonna be equally close to the center for this one. So you're expecting to have a big brawl in the center, and each player to set up their objective marker in their respective quarters, I'm gonna call it. So between their dagger and their shield, basically. However, with Bloodbath, you're gonna have the hammers of the opponent come in where you're most likely gonna place your objective marker. So that puts a lot of pressure on turn 2 and can really turn this objective around, which oftentimes is quite standoffish because you're just fighting around the big one center objective and the others are firmly held by their respective players. But in this case, it can really be changed up quite a lot, the game. So I really like this one.
And another thing I like about this one that you chose is that a lot of the time in Warcry, because hammers come on so late in so many different deployments, it's really tempting to put everything in the shield, a decent amount of things in the dagger, and have your hammer almost be an afterthought. But this one actually kind of rewards people who have put legitimate units in their hammer, right? Because if your opponent has only just 2 weak chaff units in their hammer, you might still just happily put your objective in right in the middle of your quarter and then just figure you can just blow those 2 chaff units off the board as soon as they arrive. And you don't even have to worry about them. But then if your opponent has actually spread things around, then you have really difficult decisions all of a sudden. Yeah, so I really like this one. And then the 2 twists that you put with it, +1 move is really interesting because it, any of these sort of objectives where it's easy to protect one of them, the +1 move, if it's there, can really change your calculations for when you're doing it.
Yeah, that is true. Can you still hear me all right? Because I think we are having minor connection issues.
I can still hear you, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, it should be all good now, and I think I had a small internet drop there, but doesn't matter.
Okay, cool. We can either cut this out or leave it in so that
No,
people can hear the hear how it really works sometimes.
I think it wasn't too bad here.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so then so I'll just get into my second one, which is combining Death Blow and No Quarter. So Death Blow I really like this one because, so one, starting 2 different deployment groups on the ground, each in their own quarter, sort of, especially with No Quarter, it gives each player the idea that they're going to be controlling a certain piece of the battlefield right from the beginning. So it starts off as a very straightforward battle, but then because once again those little hammers coming in midway through the game, it all of a sudden turns 2 of the quarters into being contested. And so it sets up 2 battles, and then I find that this one is often decided by there are 2 battles going on, and then one player surprises the other by showing them that a piece of the battlefield that they didn't think was contested actually is, or they just, you all of a sudden give up on one of the fights and take the fight somewhere else and just completely switch it around. So I just find that this one can be an incredibly tactical mission in general, just because there are so many different places you have to worry about.
Yeah, No Quarter is possibly the best victory condition in Warcry. Anything can have a big impact, really. Like, you have a movement ability turn 3 that allows you to move further than your enemy anticipated and get into a quarter that he was thinking was secure, can be big. pulling abilities to pull people out of quarters or push them into others can be very big. There's so many cool tactical things you can play here. As you said, like dashing last minute somewhere where your opponent wasn't expecting you to go. It it requires everyone to have a big field of view to keep a check where your opponents are and how fast they can move. It's really interesting. It's a really, really good scenario. There's a lot of fighting still because you're trying to get rid of those models. Yeah, great one. Great choice.
Yeah, and the one drawback to it that I wanted to just
Salty,
mention, because
are
no
you still there?
scenario is perfect, is that it does really benefit any warband with just a lot of models, right? Because when you just have lots of numbers, you just start. It's just harder to win the numbers game against you. But that's okay because every scenario benefits some type of warband. So it's just good to just make sure that the different scenarios you're choosing for your tournament benefit different types of warbands. So if you're using no quarter, consider also having something like Bloodmarked or one of the ones where it's killing one specific thing, where the warbands with tons of models, they don't necessarily benefit as much from that.
Yeah.
And then for the two twists that I wanted to show for that, one is Howling Winds, which is one of the ones that sort of hamstrings ranged abilities, and the other is Gore Moon Rises, which just adds 1 to the value of your abilities. It's a pretty small difference most of the time, but every once in a while, some warbands find it just to be really amazing. There's a few abilities out there that are like add half the dice roll to the attack's characteristic, and then you're comboing that with, say, like a Varangard or a Orc Mega Boss, which do a lot of damage in very few attacks, and then all of a sudden they can, pump out 30 damage in one activation. So that's one that is very warband specific. But then Howling Winds is important because sometimes no quarter can be a little bit rough if the other person can just sit in their corners and then shoot you in your quarter from theirs. So Howling Winds can give one player the ability to kind of mitigate that somewhat. So let's get into your next one, which is Deadly Gambit.
Yeah.
Along with, you had actually 3 different options for this one.
I do. I'm running Bloodmark, Cut Off the Head, or the one where you have to kill the dagger. Forgot what the name was.
Shock and Awe.
Shock and Awe?
Yep.
Shock and Awe, yes. I think all of those are possible options here. I'm personally the biggest fan of Shock and Awe, actually. Because killing an entire battle group is well, it requires more of you. It allows the opponent to possibly split up, and so on. And if you happen to not have any super strong fighters in this one battle group that's on the table, well, you're not goofed like if you were playing Bloodmarked, essentially. Deadly Gambit obviously is a very, very explosive setup because you can either choose to run at your opponent's daggers turn 1, or kind of get crushed between the shield and hammer in the second turn. So it basically requires the daggers to go at it. At the same time, losing your dagger is what you really don't want to happen in this one if you're playing Shock and Awe. And I think that makes for a very, very interesting combination there. And also, something to keep in mind is for all of these killing objectives, so Bloodmarked, Cut Off the Head, and also Shock and Awe, and all the comparable ones, there's no time limit on these. So there's no turn limit, I'm sorry. therefore you kind of need to make sure it's going relatively quickly, because especially in a tournament environment, you're not gonna have endless amounts of times. Warcry is gonna be easier for that for sure than Age of Sigmar, for example. But you're going to have to finish your games in whatever, half an hour or something, and you don't want it to drag on for 6 battle rounds, because that's going to take a lot of time and make everyone wait, potentially. I think this one is a great explosive setup with, yeah, a cool victory condition as well.
Yeah, and having only one deployment group on the field round one does make round one just go really fast. And then,
Yes.
yeah, the times I've played Deadly Gambit, it's amazing because you just feel this sort of weight hanging over your head, knowing that um, the pincer move is coming, and you have to be extremely proactive right away. I think this is the
Exactly.
one that we ended up both choosing. Yeah, so this is my scenario
Yes.
3 as well. Um, so great minds think alike and all of that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I just think that Deadly Gambit is. I'm not sure if it's my absolute favorite deployment, but it's pretty close regardless. I just think it's tactically one of the most interesting deployments. Yeah, in the game
For
and
sure.
that they could possibly think of.
Yep.
Um, so let's get into some sort of twist options that fit with it. You chose Bitter Rivals, which we talked about before, and then Bloodwind, which I have too. So yeah, what do you love about the Bloodwind twist with this one?
Again, as this is one of these, you have to kill a lot of models, but no turn limit. Anything that makes the game faster isn't a bad choice, and Bloodwind is gonna give people extra attacks and extra strength. But what I love about Bloodwind is that it's not just like a flat, okay, everyone is stronger now. Instead, it gives you tactical thought, because you have to choose wisely who you damage. If you're just gonna put a couple of damage on a strong opponent model, that's gonna ramp that model up so badly, it's not gonna be worth the couple of damage you did. So focusing things down is gonna be very important. Not spreading that damage around too much. Um, Bloodwind is actually one of the things where people climb over dangerous fences themselves willingly, or jump down walls because they want to take a bit of damage, the falling damage, to get that Bloodwind buff. So it encourages different playstyles, which I always think is very good. And yeah, it's just a fun twist.
Yeah, and Bloodwind is really interesting just because of the layers that are there. So I come from Magic the Gathering, where Magic pros they talk about sort of strategy being on levels. So the level one of Bloodwind is you don't really want to attack anything that you can't kill. Um,
Yep.
but then level two to that becomes your opponent has the same concern, so they want to push things that are hard to kill right into your face to sort of force you to attack them. So then that becomes this interesting subgame. And then it's also really skill testing because once you really want to push things into the opponent's face to force them to attack it, which again is perfect on Deadly Gambit because of what you said about how the daggers start attacking each other right away. Um, it's also really skill testing because then you don't want to overextend, because then all of a sudden this piece that you think is hard to kill, um, it might be hard to kill under normal circumstances, but if you've just pushed it right into the middle of their warband, all of a sudden that's not so true anymore.
Yeah, you can't even in Warcry, you can't even put a 30 wound toughness 5 model in the middle of an opponent warband and expect it to live more than one round. It's gonna die.
Hmm.
And yeah, that also makes for an interesting strategy. You're right there.
Yeah. So then the other deployment that we both chose, I already talked about doing no quarter on Deathblow, but then you also have higher ground here. So do you want to talk a little bit about the higher ground victory condition?
Yeah. So higher ground is an interesting one, because It's none of the traditional hold points, zones, or kill this and that unit. Instead, you're supposed to hold territory. So buildings, platforms. Um, you score this one at the end of every battle round, and you get points for any models on buildings. So in the first, so basically, for every decision you take, you're gonna have to wonder: do I get at my opponent, try to attack him to get him off a building and so on, but possibly I'm forgoing a point I could make myself by just standing on the top of a building. Very interesting that way because it forces sometimes a lot of movement instead of fighting. Um, it's it's a good one for ranged warbands, and I don't think we have to condemn ranged as a whole in Warcry. Some people seem to think that ranged warbands are horrible. Um, this one is good for ranged warbands. They want to put their best ranged models on top of buildings and shoot down on opponents for sure. But it's about the opponent making the right plays to counter that. You can you have some warbands that get access to to pulling abilities, so to get opponents off buildings. There's a lot of interesting things to be done here, and I've played this a couple of times and always had a great amount of fun.
Yeah, and one thing that I think makes Deathblow a good combination with it is starting warbands sort of all around the battlefield instead of, some of the others, like I love Dance of Death, but, you're not really starting scattered around the battlefield, you're starting in very specific places. So here it kind of gives every different type of warband a fighting chance at finding their way to some terrain,
Yes, so
which I
obviously
think is
you'll want
important.
some terrain, like a setup with some decent amount of platforms. You can't choose just a bell tower in the middle. That's going to be miserable.
Mhm.
Um, and with how it's split up, but then again with the hammers coming in round two, even like your close combat warbands get a good shot at removing or getting into your most dangerous opponent models that are probably in the shield. So even if I'm running Stormcast and I have two big old shooting units in my shield sitting on a building, well, turn two, my opponent is gonna have his hammer come right 6 inches away from me and start running at me basically. So yeah, it just breaks up that possible stalemate or like any kind of building of fortresses essentially.
Yeah, and I saw that this is the one, I think. Oh, okay, no quarter is the one. So let's talk about then the twists that you chose for this one for higher ground. So Winds of Fate and Circling Flock. Oh, funny, those are sort of
Those
opposite
are
twists
kind
of
of
each other.
opposing, yes. Um, Winds of Fate, we kind of talked about that. It's just interesting. As you said, like sometimes abilities don't play as great a role, and I think there's models, for example, that have great quad abilities. There's some really cool quad abilities in the game, but from my experience, and I also I've got a video on it, how showing how often you roll quads actually and so on. Quads play a very insignificant role in Blood Bowl, as what I'm talking about, not Blood Bowl, Warcry overall.
Yeah.
Um, and 7 initiative dice really change that. You're gonna roll a lot more triples naturally, and then giving that can get easily a quad by obviously using one wild dice. So I think it's a very interesting one. Again, if your opponent knows that you have the greatest quads in the world, he's gonna block that, but he might not know, and he might have a good quad himself, and so on. So it's a cool one there. And yeah, and then I opted to take the opposing one because no wild die on the first turn is also good. Mainly because you well, mainly because wild dice in the first turn are oftentimes stored. I see a ton of games where people keep their wild die for the first turn because little combat happens, you don't need your abilities as much. And that just means really that everyone has two wild dice in turn two normally. Is that
Mhm.
your experience as well?
Yeah, I generally, especially because of what you said about how rare it is to roll quads, I almost always try to bank my wild dice um, in the early part of the game, just because having that round two quad is can be so swingy. Even if all you have is rampage, it can still just the earlier you rampage someone, the better, right? So
Yeah, for
um,
sure.
I almost
Rampage is a
always
great one.
bank my round one wild dice.
Although do keep in mind everyone that you cannot use 2 wild dice to make a double a quad. Just putting that out there. That's not
Yeah,
legal. But still, you're right. Like banking wild dice turn one is always great, and I think circling flock just removes that one banked wild dice everyone's relying on.
hmm um, and then so I wanted to talk about my next one. So Blood Rush and Realmstone Hunt. So I wanted to talk about there's this set of four deployments that I never know what to do with them. So they are Blood Rush, Battle Lines, and then um, I think Frontal Assault, and I think Show of Strength is the other one. But they're the four
Yeah,
deployments that, yeah, that they gave us, where all three deployment groups start on the battlefield right away. Which I think, and they're all done where it's just sort of in a line facing off, like it's armies. Like so, when you see this setup, it's almost like a miniature version of Age of Sigmar when you see it on the board, and they can be a bit of a mess. Um, they can, round one. One of the nice things about Warcry is round one is usually really quick. So Warcry is really easy to show to new people because round one goes so quick. Then they figure out what's going on, and then round two is the actually really exciting round with tons of things going on everywhere. Um, these four are not that at all. So I wanted to think about a way to use them in a tournament that could still be interesting. And in our sort of pre-show the other day, you talked me out of Hidden Artifact, um, but I still like certain things about artifact missions. So um, I like the idea of a moving objective, and I like the idea that it's hard to take them. I know that some people really dislike treasures where if you kill something with your second activation, a lot of the time your opponent can go in and take it. So you do have to sort of set it up. You have to set up, say, trapping something into combat at the end of round two so that then you can steal it and also box out your opponent at the end of round or at the beginning of round three, something like that. So what I like about um, doing a treasure mission specifically for these ones where everything starts right away is that there's nowhere to really hide on the field, and I've increased that with the twists as well, where I've put let's see, where is it? Right, so rampaging beasts and insidious malignance. So if you end near terrain, you take damage, or the other twist being um, every single battle round, more chaotic beasts show up, which does put a little bit of pressure on uh, tournament runners to have all of those chaotic beasts from the starter set sort of painted. But if you have them, they can be such a great asset because putting them in a game gives warbands with fewer units just more to do, right? So it can, if they're clever about how they use it, it can uh, sort of be a bit of a catch-up mechanic there. And then I changed it to Realmstone Hunt for um, which is the one where each player sets up 2 treasure tokens on platforms. So you're constrained by where you can put them, but each player should be able to find 2 where they have the advantage for taking them. Now, you do get a big advantage if you have a big 10 movement flyer in this mission because you can go steal one of your opponent's treasures right away, and then
Yep.
they have to do some work. But at least because each player is putting 2 up there, and because the whole team starts right away, you can usually set it up so that your treasures are pretty well defended. So this sort of mitigates that risk a lot more than the other treasure mission, Hidden Artifact, does. So that's why I switched it from Hidden to Realm Stone Hunt. But so this is one where, like I said before, the ones where everything starts turn 1 can be a bit of a mess. This is one where I'm just really embracing the chaos and putting as much on the field as possible to sort of create a memorable game that way.
Yeah, again, with that one has to keep in mind it's going to take longer than other games. With everything, as you said, like turn 1 is going to take a long time, so this might be a 1-hour game, which is long for Warcry.
Yeah, I wouldn't suggest this in every tournament, but let's say if you're sort of conflicted on how many rounds to run and you end up going towards fewer, so let's say, because you could theoretically do 5 rounds of Warcry in a day, in the way that they do 3 rounds of Age of Sigmar in a day. But if you think that that might be too much, then you could drop down to 4 and use one of these sort of big deployments to try that.
I think actually in the tournament I run we played 9 games. It was 3 against the same opponent and on the same battlefields each time. But obviously with different setups and victory conditions, because you can chain those together relatively quickly if you don't change the terrain and so on in between. And then you would change opponent and build a new board for the next 3. Yeah, that's also a way to go about it for sure.
That's interesting. I was only thinking Swiss tournaments, but yeah, that's a good way to get a lot of games in to avoid sort of resetting up. And then you took a stab at doing one of those big messy ones too. So let's talk about what you made with Battle Lines.
Yes, so Battle Lines is it's, as you said, it's a big messy one. It's got everyone on the board. What I think is interesting is that the shield starts in the back. Normally, oftentimes you find that your shield is the first one to be engaged. With this one, you're gonna have your hammer and dagger be kind of more significant than your shield early on. For no quarter, obviously, as we talked about no quarter, why no quarter is so good. And in this setup, you won't get anyone.
Oh.
It's basically impossible to completely block off an area, anyways. People can always climb in over a building or run past your units, essentially, and therefore, I don't think it's for no quarter that important to start in different to have someone come in from the back. And yeah, I think people will obviously fight about that over that middle line there. It's gonna be kind of like a field battle that way, but you can dash across the line in the last instance. You can pull back whenever you fight next to the center. You have a lot of options with your fighters to move anywhere, and yeah, it's just it's kind of one where the brawly warbands have a good chance, even though no quarter is kind of a more fast-moving mission, I feel.
Yeah, this is one of the ones that's going to feel like small Age of Sigmar more than almost any other way to play Warcry, which isn't a bad thing, that's sort of almost GW's hope with Warcry, is that people will be tempted from this game to their big game. So this, I think, is the closest analog that you can get in Warcry to just a small Age of Sigmar game. Which I think is really interesting. And then this is the one where you talked about putting anti-range in this one potentially, because rather than me paraphrase what you said in the pre-show, how about you explain it yourself?
when when I'm choosing battle lines as a setup, I know there's a big distance to walk between the warbands, and if one of them is gonna be super ranged, the other one is gonna have a big amount of trouble because you're just not gonna get near to that because you don't have a battle group starting behind them. You can't not come to them. You can't hide behind buildings because you need to get into those quarters. So I felt like in this one it was important to limit range somewhat, and therefore I put two range limiting twists in here. So therefore, if not both opponents agree that they'd rather not have a twist, there's gonna be some limit to range. So you can't, as the ranged player, just right out eliminate one of the two, and still have your full range effectiveness. I chose Blizzard because I think Blizzard is the one of the coolest twists and certainly the best one to hamper ranged. It limits maximum range to 9 inches, which is not too bad. Like that's not gonna make ranged units useless at all. 9 inches is still a great range, especially in Warcry. And on top of that, it gives you, uh, if you don't move, you might take damage. So that's another small limitation to ranged actually, because if you're just sitting on a building and shooting at someone for 2 activations straight, well, you're gonna take 3 damage, possibly, only if you roll a 1. But it's a little bit of a thing to keep in mind. And yeah, it's just gonna stop that turn 1 spamming of horrible ranged if you have that big advantage.
And then Dusk lets them sort of do their full barrage on turn 1, but then it stops a ranged warband from necessarily punishing slow ones quite as much, because then on round 2 and 3, they can't do that anymore. So they get their first bit of candy, getting to pummel you right away, but then that's kind of it, which I think is
Exactly.
interesting.
I think Dusk doesn't limit ranged warbands too much. They still get a good amount of firing in there. Um, but yes, it's just limiting them a bit, and I think that's not a horrible thing. I wouldn't want any all 4 scenarios to be limiting range because that would be very unfair. But I think for one, especially this one with this setup, to have a bit of a limit on range is good.
Yeah, and notice that in the 3 range twists that we chose, neither of us chose something that's like absolutely draconian to range. So I'm thinking about Deluge, which I just think is one of the worst twists in the game, and should just be fired into the sun, where it's you can't even target more than 6 inches away right from the beginning,
Yeah,
and then you can't even use terrain because you climbing every inch of climbing counts for two
makes
inches.
2 inches. Yeah,
So if you
only the
don't have
fastest of models will have any chance of getting up there.
right. So yeah, Deluge is I think my absolute least favorite twist in all of Warcry. But any of those where they are an absolute auto loss if you have more than 3 ranged units in your warband. Um, we haven't chosen those. We've chosen ones where it taxes a ranged warband a little bit, but doesn't shut them down.
Yeah, it's the same goes for Dead of Night. It literally just says if you have a range of more than 3, you can't use it.
Yeah,
What's the
Dead of Night
point?
is
Like,
pretty rough too.
why even add that to the game? I don't know. Seems horrible.
Yeah, I agree. And then like Dawn, I get why it's in the game. It's just the opposite of Dusk, but having it that way, having 3 inches right away, then 6, then 9, then 12, is just so brutal. Because it just
It's immensely brutal.
yeah,
Once you have a decent amount of range, you're gonna not have anyone in that far range because everyone's gonna be in your face at that point.
right.
Um, so so Dawn, it's almost the same as Dead of Night. You're just not gonna be using a lot of range at all.
Yeah. Um, so this is good. We've sort of set up a whole bunch of different ones here. I think if you are running tournaments and you have the luxury of saying doing one a month or so, I would try out different ones from here so that you're rewarding different types of lists per tournament. Obviously, only 8 rounds. There's a lot more that you can go into, but hopefully seeing how we've picked all these can sort of give you your own ideas for how to pick different scenarios. Um, yeah, do you have anything you wanted to mention, Reedo, on like sort of how we've gone about picking these, like in general?
I think we've talked about our thinking process behind most of them, and I'm sure the viewers get what we're getting at, and I'm sure they are going to be able to make their own perfect tournaments.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and there's definitely a little bit more meat on the bone we've left here, so maybe we can come back to this uh, after a few months, maybe after even some tournaments have happened, where we can talk about other kinds of setups you can do. But otherwise,
Sure.
I'm really happy with where we got to with this. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you very much for initiating it. I hope to have you on my channel in the near future as well. So possibly some of my viewers get to see you too. That would be great. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'd absolutely love that. It was a real pleasure having you on. It's been a dream of the channel for a while, and yeah, I'm excited. We'll be back with more videos in the future, and until then, may all your rolls be crits.